I call Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you for the acclamation. Mr Speaker, anyone listening to this debate, I think, would have heard on balance a reasonably constructive debate, perhaps with the exception of David Bennett. There are things that unite us. There are things that unite us in this House, but there are also deeply held principles which we will dispute and which we will dispute in a constructive way. As opposition MPs, and we've all noticed this and known this over the past 6 years, we are often forced to take the on-balance view. And this bill is an example of that in the most extreme. But let's be under no illusion. If right now we were voting on the first iteration of this bill that came before this House, I doubt very much you would see support from Labor on that version of the bill. In fact, you absolutely wouldn't. It was a bill we just could not support. And it was made absolutely clear in some of the speeches that were first given in the House that we had 5 main concerns. The fact that it allowed warrantless surveillance for up to 48 hours, the fact that the bill did not expire, the sunset clause, until 2018, the fact that it enabled the SIS to conduct visual surveillance like the police, the fact that it increased access to the customs database, and that it extended the period passports could be cancelled from 1 year up to 3. I think everyone in this House would agree that those were significant steps to be taking as a parliament, and that we had to be assured that there were grounds for those steps to be taken. And it was our view that there weren't grounds to go as far as that bill first suggested. Let's also be absolutely clear. If we were just voting based on the process that this bill underwent, we also wouldn't be voting in favour of it. The process by which we came to debate some extraordinarily significant issues was appalling to the extreme. I think everyone would probably agree that the United Kingdom, and in fact on ratings they are, the United Kingdom and Australia are facing a significantly higher threat to their security than New Zealanders, and yet they are taking greater time to debate and consider these similar powers than we did. And we never heard the justification for that from the government. Now look, we understand that there will always be security and intelligence information that we as citizens or even opposition members of the House are not privy to, and for good reason. And in those circumstances, we therefore place an enormous amount of trust in those who are privy to that information. But if the only comparator that we have is the fact that the UK, who also has similar threats and who also isn't able to share that information, is still taking more time than we are, then of course that sows the seeds of doubt as to what the motivation was and whether it was justified. The fact that we had a 2-day process, and yet still in that time there were 588 submissions, speaks more about the concern of citizens in New Zealand than it does about how grateful the government was that so many people were still willing to submit. In fact, I've almost heard it termed as a victory on that side of the House that so many people were still willing to come forward and engage under those circumstances. It was not a victory. How many people missed out because of that short time frame, or were unable to be heard given only 63 submitters were heard? Yes, I congratulate the committee for putting in such long hours to hear as many as they could, but it did not have to be that way. And the great irony, of course, is that we're proposing that spy agencies be given 48 hours of warrantless surveillance, but we wouldn't even give that long to submitters to submit on the bill that would have granted that power. But these, Mr Speaker, were not the basis on which we as an opposition were forced to make a decision as to whether or not we would support the bill. Yes, we accept that there is an increased threat. We accept that the acts of terror undertaken by ISIS are heinous and should not and cannot be tolerated by any nation state. Yes, we accept that the international environment in which we're operating now is very different than even what it was 10 years ago. We accept all of those premises, but how much do we trade of our inalienable rights in order to meet all of those threats that we accept? Well, not as much as the government first proposed. And I want to acknowledge the work that David Shearer and Phil Goff did on behalf of the Labour Party to push extremely hard in the Select Committee in a constructive way to change some of the fundamental elements of this bill. And I just want to cover some of those briefly, Mr. Speaker. First of all, warrantless searches. It's a massive step. The threshold needs to be extraordinarily high. As introduced, the bill allowed warrantless searches to, quote, detect activities prejudicial to security or for the purpose of gathering foreign intelligence information that is essential to security. That was the definition. This bill was introduced under the premise that we were only tackling international terrorist acts. That's what this bill was meant to be around. That definition was far too broad to ensure that those were the only circumstances under which it was used. And so it was because of Labour that that definition has been narrowed as far as it has now. The bill also allowed a time frame that was far too generous and unnecessarily so. And so the Select Committee again argued it down to 24 hours, not 48. And extra safety provisions, extra safeguards have been added. The SIS will have to report to the public every 6 months rather than annually on the use of the powers that have been granted to them. And also the Director of Security Intelligence Service will be required to immediately notify the Commissioner of Warrants and the Inspector General of Intelligence when using this warrantless power. The second major change was to the sunset clause. Sunset clause, of course, meaning the expiration of a bill. And we do tend to do this when we use a controversial extension of powers. We did it when we extended supervision orders for offenders, for instance. It gives the chance for Parliament to review its use. But as introduced, the sunset clauses in this bill didn't expire until April 2018. That would mean a new Parliament would discuss and debate it. And it was, of course, quite far out. I think it's right that the Select Committee made sure that it would expire on the 1st of April 2017. Now, part of our argument has been that this should be part of a wider review of our security and intelligence agencies, and we still argue that review should have taken place even before we saw the massive changes to the GCSB powers, and we continue to argue for that broader review, Mr. Speaker. And finally, of course, there were changes to the Customs and Excise Act. The Passport Acts, the ability to cancel a passport for 3 years rather than 12, we continue to have concerns about that, but made sure that, of course, we would never leave a citizen stateless if their passport were to be revoked. And those, again, were assurances that Labour sought at the Select Committee's stage. Mr. Speaker, there has been considerable talk in this House about perception, except perhaps we've talked about perception in the wrong direction. There's been a view that terrorist agencies would be looking at what New Zealand would be doing in its domestic context to tackle terrorism. But what about what New Zealanders perceive of this legislation and this process? This law may now be one on balance where we've worked hard to preserve those inalienable rights of New Zealanders. But a balanced view was not what was brought to the debate in the lead up to this law. The perception posed by the government left members of our ethnic community feeling vilified and feeling targeted, and that was wrong. Yes, perception matters, but what has this process done to that community? And that's why I absolutely believe that we must defend as much or even more vehemently than our security. We must defend our independence, we must defend our inclusiveness, and we must defend more than just tolerance in our society. And I'm extremely sad about what this process has done to damage that.